Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our brief training today. That's going to be part of our Virginia Customized Employment Training Library. And today we're going to be talking about modern job coaching. Specifically, we're going to be getting into some really kind of innovative, cutting edge strategies that I think are very adaptive to the times and the needs of both the individuals we work with in terms of our job seekers and businesses. And we'll be talking about, and within that framework, we're going to hear from Griffin Hamas about consultative job coaching as a innovative approach, as well as some different ways that we can integrate technology into supporting job seekers remotely on the job site. So again, I think this is really exciting. I've been privy to several conversations over the last 3 months where a lot of the challenges that are being identified really crosswalk well to what we're going to be talking about. And those are things in terms of how we're working with employers because of the pandemic and concerns that they have about having job coaches there on site. It has to do with staffing within our ESOs as we're kind of working our way through really a workforce crisis in a lot of ways. So how can we be more efficient and more effective? And then thirdly, I think it has to do with feedback we've been hearing from our businesses for quite a while. And it's really, how can we support you the most effectively when we're working with an individual that might be receiving job coaching services? And it's a lot about how can you give us the tools so we can train the individual, how we can support the individual, and how can you do it in a way that really is transparent and it doesn't interrupt with business process and flow. So with that, I am going to turn it over to my good friends, Nancy Brooks Lane and Doug Crandall, and they are going to talk to you about consultative training supports and modern job coaching today.
Well, thank you, Richard. Appreciate that. This is an exciting topic. And to really fully understand it, I think a little quick anecdote. We have a private-public partnership here in our area in Georgia. And the person that heads that up has a quote about job coaching. And he often says, you have one of the most powerful tools to connect economic development and human services and businesses in job coaching, and we're not living up to its potential. So let's take a little bit of a look on this next slide at kind of just a baseline. We know what job coaching is, but we know it in the way that we have applied it after the supported employment demonstration grants of the late 1980s, and not a lot has changed. But job coaching in and of itself is obviously supporting somebody who has a label of a disability to both learn and perform a job. Sometimes that learning involves, as we all know, ways to communicate, to be able to track performance, engage with your supervisor, have relationships with coworkers. And ideally, that job coaching involves a training plan. We've all heard over the years this idea of fading to 20%, and fading is a strange way to tell a business that you're going to be there for them. But that is what we have kind of made traditional in our systems. Now, it's also important under the ADA to understand that job coaching is an accommodation for lots of workers, whether that's mental health disabilities, learning disabilities, intellectual and developmental disabilities, workers who are neurodivergent. And so job coaching is a powerful tool. The reality of it, though, is it hasn't been able to be truly embraced because we continue, for the most part, to get folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities only jobs in service industry. It's very difficult to think about job coaching in the traditional way if we're helping people get jobs in industries and positions that are not service related, i.e., we must then somehow become this repository of all employment knowledge ever. And as Richard and Nancy have said, COVID really made us think about this. The direct support professional shortage has made us really think about this. Griffin Hamas realizes that in customized employment, everything must be done differently. And we must embrace, just as we do in customized job development, new tools to do modern job coaching. So we're going to take a look at these different elements that are driving modern job coaching. The consultative training and supports approach, the fidelity scale that Griffin Hammis has developed, is in line with how we do discovery and customized employment, how we do customized job development. In other words, we must use different tools and do those practices to fidelity if we want to change the way that services are delivered. So that can happen through, obviously, remote job coaching, technology-based methods, and all of that feeds into redefining what we want to fund and what businesses and job seekers want out of job coaching. So what is the consultative training and support? What does it recognize? Well, again, if we're only getting people jobs that are not that difficult to teach and task, then it's possible to probably keep doing traditional job coaching. But we want to continue to work on people's vocational themes, their ideal conditions of employment, embrace customized job development, which takes us to different industries and different types of jobs. Therefore, we need to be in a consulting role with the job seeker and the business so that we are embracing that real knowledge transfer that we only get from coworkers. And in that way, the employment specialist, the job coach, whatever term we're using, is going to use a different set of skills. They're not going to be sitting back and monitoring someone's performance. They're not going to be showing up long-term for the life of a job. They're really going to look at those natural supports, the customary and ordinary ways that people learn. And when we supplement that, our value to a business setting is that we can help with training, skill acquisition, all of those things that are so important. So doing that allows us then again to focus on new skills, to focus on those ideal conditions of employment. And in that way, we become much more valuable to a business than we do currently with these traditional approaches. And as Nancy will talk about, even business wants us to change that. The consultative training and supports this focus on doing this part of job coaching very differently. It does ensure fidelity to customized employment practices after the person is hired. We've spent some time in the Virginia Brief Training series really talking about how you connect discovery, customized job development, and this is the third leg to the stool. It is that we are doing this part differently too, because we know then that long-term inclusion and sustainability in a job is possible. And to honor that, of course, many folks can think back about how they learned some difficult tasks at their job, who they turn to, and we can be much less intrusive and much more of a value to both the coworker, supervisor, and the person who is working. Not only does it comply and embed in job coaching all the values and principles of person-centeredness that we see in discovery and customized job development, it does result in much better outcomes. Number of years ago, Dr. Robert Samara did a study where it didn't involve really everything we're talking about today, but he wanted to look at if there were job coaches trained in true natural supports, i.e. seeking out input from supervisors and coworkers, would that result in better wages? And it did, and longer term employment and more hours, all because staff doing this work were trained. It was kind of a preliminary kind of groundwork, the undergirding for the consultative training and supports. And so we know that when we do this to fidelity, we're going to get better outcomes. Just like we know if we do discovery to fidelity and customized job development. The trick is making sure that we're doing that as a community of practice. Mentioned this early on, and this is one of those slides I think is really helpful just to print off and keep nearby. But it compares and contrasts the consultative modern approach to training and supports versus simply traditional job coaching. Now, this first one's important, and I won't go through every one of those, but inside of our disability systems, often we either have CEOs or CFOs looking at, well, this is going to be a great cost savings. It doesn't mean you get somebody a job and you dump the person on the business. That's not what it means. However, coworkers are supported and responsible for the skill and task training. In traditional job coaching, we've even said to businesses, don't worry about it. I'll be here all the time. You need to do nothing. That's a strange way to approach inclusion in the workplace. In the traditional way of job coaching, everything is kind of divvied up, and there might even be different people involved. And so this best practice, this fidelity scale, looks at making sure that there's some continuity across job development, on-site training, long-term support, all of that involving coworkers and supervisors. Now, when we talk about tools under consultative training and supports, we're really talking about ways that people are taught. Now, some places we can all think about where you had maybe even an orientation manual, you had very specific things you had to learn, and then you've been in other jobs where it's very informal. The point is, there are ordinary training methods. And in job coaching, we've kind of pared that down to it's just the individual and just the job coach. That's not what we're talking about here. The coworker business may even be compensated, might provide some stipends for some of those new skills and training. Only the job coach is compensated in the old model. The rest of this is really looking at how we meet teaching and consulting with a business to make sure that what we're doing also includes people in the social fabric. We make bonds with people who teach us something. Work culture skills are just as equally important as job skills. We can all think of people who can do the job skills perfectly, but have not had the opportunity to connect and be part of the real workplace. And in that way, in the consultative training and supports, and you'll see this in the fidelity scale, there's an emphasis put on how we go about these things. It's a very purposeful way of engaging coworkers and supervisors. And finally, then that's a very proactive way of doing this kind of consultation. It's not a reaction to a problem, but it's looking down the road. We're giving people skills in the job site, not just for the focus person, the job seeker with disabilities, the worker with disabilities, but also new skills through our consultative approach for coworkers and supervisors. And I'll just finish this on the comparison. Obviously, there are ESOs and other programs that really get the consultative approach. But for the most part in the United States, job coaching is still very traditional. Never intended to be, by the way, was always supposed to be consultative in nature.
This brings us into the next area that is really pretty revolutionary and a game changer. When Doug and I were shifting from a more segregated traditional system to a community-based system, both in the area of employment and what people do when they're not working. We would have loved to have had the opportunity to bring technology further into the role of this work we do. Think about how our own lives have improved with the ability to use technology. I know there are some ways it's not improved, but that's something that we need to shape in our own life and not dig into areas that are a bit dysfunctional in the area of technology. Remote job coaching. We have learned from virtual meetings or using platforms like Zoom and Teams that we can have effective team gatherings without everybody having to get into a mode of transportation to physically be in a space together for what, an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours, for whatever the length of the meeting is, and then disperse wherever you need to be. It's not good for the environment. It's not good for the mental health of workers who are trying to get so much done during a day. The use of technology for job coaching just makes total sense. It's a promising practice, and it's to supplement in-person support, not replace it. It gives us one more tool in our toolkit to be able to ensure a person is acclimating well to the job and all the different facets of what it means to be a worker. Use of phones, computers, tablets, to text, email, to make calls, to connect through video platforms, those are being used in some areas in the country already, actually in the world. It is a progressive mindset. It's a mind reset, and can create, as you'll see in a slide shortly, the benefits of that. But the first step is determine if technology, from both the perspective of the employee who's receiving job coaching and the employer, is workable, that it fits with their preferences and it can meet the needs of both. Here we are at that slide on benefits. Being able to use technology in those ways that I mentioned, it's less intrusive, so it creates less of a stigma. And anytime we create stigma, it makes the individual seem other than. We have to fight that. Not only are we job coaching, but we're also trying to create some normality out of a situation that sometimes seems less than normal when a job coach is physically present. It increases efficiency. Not only, as you'll see in a slide shortly, can the employee with the disability receive immediate help by using technology, or help at a time that might be within the same day, as opposed to the person saying, well, I have to fit you my schedule, I can see you in a day or two. It increases efficiency for access and immediate information that the employee needs. It might be a very brief bit of info that is a quick fix, or it might be more intensive where planning can take place so a situation does not get out of hand. Also, it increases efficiency for the person who is in the role of a job coach, supporting individuals and being present for them. I can remember individuals in the organizations that Doug and I directed taking sometimes an hour or 2 hours to get to a place. And imagine what could happen in that hour or 2 hours if technology could be used and the person didn't have to take that time to physically be present when that is not always necessary. Also increases opportunities for the individual who is the employee that the job coach is providing support as they're learning their job, to develop greater independence and enhance those natural supports that we all rely on. Also increases accessibility of job coaches for the employees that they're supporting, as I mentioned when I talked about increased efficiency. And then it may be a solution for job coaching needs in rural areas. If it's agreed that the employee and the employer are acceptable in terms of using technology, imagine the efficiency that creates. And many people are not receiving supports to become employed because the organizations that could provide the supports are so far away from where the person's living. That could really bridge and be a possible solution for those factors that many of us struggle through. This is so important because many people still don't realize how hiring people with disabilities and the use of technology is seen as very typical in a workplace. This is a quote from an article called "Technology Can Assist When Accommodating Employees with Disabilities," SHRM, November 22nd, 2021, if you want to look it up. It stands for the Society for Human Resource Management, and their whole goal is to create better workplaces where employers and employees thrive together as the voice of all things work, workers, and the workplace. They have many, many articles on employment and individuals with disabilities, as well as the typical work settings around best practices, improving satisfaction of employers, and achieving good outcomes as a business. Their purpose is to elevate the HR profession. Their mission is to empower people and workplaces by advancing HR practices and maximizing human potential. And the vision is to build a world of work that works for all. And I think it's that last statement that is so important, because they do have a bigger worldview and they see the workforce as including everybody, not just individuals who are highly skilled, highly educated, great work experience, but they see a place for anyone who is a part of the workforce, which is all of us, as a place to be able to support those efforts and solve any problems that might arise. And that is a long explanation, but I just think it's important that you know about SHRM, because it's a great place to Google and find information about this work we do. And in this article, it goes on to state, among many other very worthy quotes, training and resources around accommodation for employees with disabilities are abundant, and technology has been the mission critical enabler. Let me read that again. Technology has been the enabler. 41% of companies surveyed have a dedicated resource in IT to assist employees with disabilities. For people who directly report their disabilities, companies have established training programs and employee resource groups for responding and providing insights on potential accommodations. And all of that is to say that a workforce that includes individuals with disabilities and that is technology driven is not out of the norm anymore. It's part of the norm. There are, as with customized employment, we focus on those small business owners. Some of the mom and pop shops, as we say, may not be into the technology so much, but what we often find is that they have the values of wanting to work with individuals who can solve their problems. And then in small businesses, when we're thinking about customized employment, again, it is not out of the norm to find technology as a part of that workforce. And Doug and I were a part of a study that occurred around the country. And what we found, we worked with, had conversations in focus group meetings with employers. And this is one of the recommendations that employers made. And it was every one of them. The focus on strategies that decrease the role of the job coach, and this is in the business setting, while meeting the needs of employers. What that's saying is we need to get out of the way as job coaches. We need to let the natural flow of how a business trains staff, teaches, works together, and forms teams needs to be able to also be the path for the individuals with disabilities that become employed. If we can be that support, as Doug pointed out, when our expertise is needed, but like around maybe learning styles or that sort of thing, and then we can get out of the way and let the natural flow of the business take over. That totally fits with exactly what we're talking about. And this came from, and you can Google it to get the whole write-up, information brief, perspective of employers on customized employment, July 2015. We're not talking about just informally starting to use technology. We're talking about planning and strategically introducing this as one of the tools in our toolkit. These are just some of the broad-based needs to be able to move into this area as one of the types of supports provided. There have to be rules, policies, procedures, and protocols. It has to be very clear what's expected of the job coaches, as well as an agreement with the business that this makes sense, and this is how we will perform those duties that we're responsible for, using technology and when we won't use technology. There has to be an individual technology training plan for the employee receiving job coaching. We need to make sure we identify the technology the employee already uses. And then we need to be aware that there are ways to purchase technology if the person does not have it. Many businesses provide technology for employees. Also, under tools and equipment through VR, that might be a way to pay for some of the technology if it increases the opportunity for the person to perform their job well. And then also SS work incentives. There are other places as well that have sprung up out of Silicon Valley where technology products are being provided to individuals that might not otherwise have access to those. And that changes often. So also Googling technology resources that are made available free of charge to individuals who need them. Richard, what does this mean for Virginia?
Nancy and Doug, this stuff gets me excited. I think the different approaches discussed today for Virginia, both are very relevant to the work we're doing on our project. For example, we're currently running a proficiency training group, working with GHA to help our individuals that have gone through, received an ACRE credential in customized employment, who are now out there practicing, working on cases, and receiving mentoring. There's a number of elements that we look at as we're training folks, and we measure their performance on, and we measure their progress to determine whether or not they're proficient. And we look at fidelity of practice, and we look at level of independence. The cool thing is this whole consultative employment coaching approach is a component of that proficiency training model. So folks have been introduced to it, but they're really going to get that support, because at the end of the day, I think what we're talking about here is job coaching within this context and the information we shared today really being something quite different than the way we've thought of it in the past, the way we've defined it in the past, and the way that the community understands and expects it to be done. despite the fact that we know that, like, for example, employers are saying, hey, these are the things that would help us to be more effective at recruiting, retaining, and supporting job coaches with disabilities and who might be receiving supported employment. There is that change, right? So I think in Virginia, a couple points is we're going to be doing some training on this. We're going to develop folks that get mentoring and coaching to a point where they really feel comfortable and confident at doing this. I would say on the technology side, that's a little bit different than the consultative approach, in that I think Virginia has some experience in that area. We're real fortunate to have worked with VCU RRTC on a RSA grant that included several different projects. One of those projects was looking at handheld technology, or PDAs, as cognitive behavioral aids in the workplace for individuals that were receiving supported employment. And as we implemented that, we found that to be very successful through that research grant. The agency, DARS, decided to really ensure that we integrated those things that worked. And so, we afterwards, we implemented projects with vendors where we provided them loaner devices so that the coaches could become familiar with them, so that the coaches could, if they're working with somebody, say, doing this essay, they could present it to the individual and test it out to see if it was working. And if it seemed like something that might be promising, then we had a model where the job coach would connect with one of our internal AT experts along with the client. And the three of them would discuss and identify technology that might be beneficial. The job coach would go back and work with the individual to learn how to use it and to observe whether or not it was effective, and then be that feedback loop if we needed to come back to our AT experts on that. In addition, we developed these AT kits that we were able to take out and demonstrate to different partner agencies at events, or to even provide loaners to our clients out of those kits to help make decisions. So I like all of this coming together. What really excites me is that we have a plan in place. These are things that we know add value. These are things that are kind of part of that essential evolution and modernization of the practice of job coaching. I think there's things that mean a lot to me. So I'll close on this, my anecdotal story. This morning, before I joined you, Doug and Nancy, I had a team meeting for my son. So I have a high school son with autism. And I was meeting with this team because we had recently done an IEP review for eligibility. And one of the things that we were talking about a lot that came up throughout that was that he struggled in a lot of the areas as it related to executive functioning, organizing, planning, initiative, problem solving, just a whole range of things. And we have some supports in place at school, but that tends to be supports he gets from a teacher that's his case manager that he works with in a resource classroom, right? And during that time, we were also talking about some of his goals for moving on to the trade center. So about 3 weeks ago, I reached out to the school and I said, hey, can we look at some AT? We talked about executive functioning be a challenge, and I kind of listed out some of the things, and I think there could be some AT solutions in here to help my son Landon with being more independent and then really giving them that opportunity to achieve his goal, just based on what I know from how we've done this at VR. We had a really great team meeting. They brought in their internal AT expert. I talked to my son this morning about it. She was like, what is that? Why do I want it? I was like, well, you want to go to work, man. You talked about the trade center and you talked about you really like being independent in the school. You don't like it. A lot of times when people kind of want to show you or do, or, it feels intrusive to you, right? And when he heard those things, he was like, oh yeah, okay, I like that. That sounds good, right? So it's, these kind of things, man, they're normalizing. They really put individuals in a place where they're more empowered. It's consistent with the idea of self-determination and people maximizing their independence. And then, I think this was hit on throughout the discussion today. These are the kind of things that are with folks for life. They might need some on-time technical assistance and support to generalize to a new setting. But if these tools, right, we start working with folks while they're still in school, and they're learning how to use them to navigate, learn, remember, whatever it might be. And then we can transition them into the workplace using that, and we have all those supports. And I think it solves a lot of the challenges as it relates to our workforce crisis. And I also think it's just the right thing to do.
Richard, I love that you have brought in the lived experience piece to this. The three of us bring lived experience to this work. It's not just theory. It's actual part of living, and that can bring an overlay of support and knowledge as we work with individuals to help them see what's possible.
Yeah, without a doubt, it's it's core to what we do, right? So I do have one question for you. I rambled on a little bit. As I mentioned, I do think there's kind of this rebranding, and sometimes the hardest thing when it comes to change is working with systems that have very strongly shaped expectations on what's going to happen. This could be family members, this could be businesses. A lot of our partners, right, are going to expect, oh, so he's going to get a job coach, and that job coach is going to be there with them 100% of the time, physically, or she. And when we start to implement these kind of new models, might there be some reaction? Are there things that we can do to kind of get ahead of the game, and in terms of that rebranding and reframing the role of a modernized job coaching approach?
Yeah, I guess it's a great question. I guess I would just say, the slide that is the kind of comparing and contrasting moves it from this program-centric approach, which you're talking about, to a support-centric approach. And it's truly person-centered. Right now, job coaching in the United States is very programmatic. Another thing I would love to see, and arguably I haven't Googled this, so maybe it exists, but it's really instructive to see businesses' point of view in those focus groups around job coaching. But I'd love to know, families and job seekers, what their experience is, if there's any survey about job coaching. My hunch would be there would probably be quite a few comments about the role of a job coach in the traditional way. But I know Sterling Peebles, who's at the UCED in Vermont, runs this employment corner and has some discussions and has broached this topic. But it might be well worth it for us to see if there's some way to, in Virginia, even do a survey. That'd be interesting.
Yeah, and I want to say, I think there was some discussion about this, and I don't know if this was done or it was anecdotal, but it does sound like there was this awareness, right, of surveys that have been done. I don't know if they hit the families and the job seekers. I think it was more towards the business, but this idea that sometimes the job coaches were the biggest barrier to success. But on the flip, there was also an idea expressed that when job coaches are professional and they do it well, that it's very valued and appreciated. And I think if we unbundled that, we would probably see those job coaches that are doing it really well are already implementing a lot of this consultative-based type of approach and model.
That's right. You got
Absolutely. Part of the system has expected individuals who have been in more of a caretaking role, because that is the model, keeping people safe. They've been put in a position to do these higher order methods that require competency-based training and certification and some experiential mentoring. And part of that has been the issue. People have not provided the training and have not hired well. The skill sets needed to keep someone safe are very different than the skill sets needed to enter the world of business and negotiate jobs and see opportunities where others may not see them. I think we have, as a system, to look at how we have got to take responsibility. There are competencies for individuals who do best practices that have been defined through research. And so we first need to hire well individuals who can see opportunities and don't carry low expectations for individuals who happen to have a disability and can do this good work And then to make sure we're providing the training they need to be successful. It's a different era. It's moving into a competency-based, research-driven system.
And hey, and I think Doug, you mentioned this earlier. I mean, all of this goes hand in hand with our new focus, our intention to put people on career pathways and to move away from this entry level service industry kind of work, right? Where maybe that job coach, and I think there's actually barriers even now with that kind of stuff, but these kind of models, like a consultative model, integrating technology for remote and offsite, increasing somebody's independence, whatever, are things that when we're in professional business and professional career pathways, the types of things that are really going to be essential to enable us to have outcomes and impact as it relates to getting our folks into those kind of careers and helping businesses see why there's a return on investment and why it's something that they want to continue to really make a priority within their organizations. So this, like I said, this stuff gets me excited. I think it's all so important. I appreciate, as always, having the time to share your company, Doug and Nancy, and look forward to our next session that will be coming out soon.